It was a cold afternoon in the winter of 2015, and 57 year old Patricia Duray was asleep on her couch inside her home in France. She had the day off from her job as a reporter for a local radio station, and she decided to spend it relaxing, just watching a movie. But at some point, she'd clearly drifted off. The sound that woke her was the familiar ding of her cell phone. Patricia slowly opened her eyes, feeling groggy and a bit disoriented. She blinked a few times, letting her living room come back into focus. The movie was still playing quietly on the television, the credits rolling. She must have been out for a while. She reached over to the coffee table and picked up her phone to see who had messaged her. The screen lit up showing a new text, but it was from a number she didn't have saved in her contacts. She tapped on the notification, and the message that appeared on her screen was strange, to say the least. It read in French, "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." For a moment, Patricia just stared at the words, completely baffled. It made no sense at all. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie. She scrolled up, and that's when she saw there were other messages in the thread from this same number, messages she had received months ago. And in that instant, she remembered exactly who this was. The person sending these cryptic texts was a middle-aged woman named Bérengère. About 8 months before this, Bérengère had approached Patricia while she was out in public. She had seemed frantic, telling Patricia that she was in desperate need of her help. The reason, Bérengère had explained, was that she worked in a castle, and that castle was haunted. Now, for most people, this would be a very strange request to receive from a stranger. But for Patricia, it wasn't entirely out of the ordinary. You see, in addition to being a well-respected local news reporter, Patricia Duray was also a self-proclaimed psychic medium. She genuinely believed she had the ability to communicate with the dead, and it was a part of her life she was very passionate about. In fact, she was quite famous for it throughout France. Because of her public profile, both as a journalist and as a medium, she attracted a lot of attention. People would often come to her with stories of paranormal activity. They'd claim their house was haunted, that they'd seen a ghost, or that strange things were happening that they couldn't explain. Patricia always tried to approach these situations with an open mind, but she was also a pragmatist. She knew that most of the time there was a perfectly logical explanation. More often than not, when she would follow up on these claims, she'd discover that the ghostly whispers were just drafty windows, the footsteps in the attic were the house settling, and the eerie shadow was just a trick of the light. There were rarely any actual spirits to communicate with. So, the vast majority of the time, when someone approached her with a story about a haunting, she took it with a grain of salt. When Bérengère had first come to her 8 months ago, talking about a haunted castle, Patricia's internal reaction was basically, sure it is. She was polite, of course, but she didn't really believe it. Bérengère, however, had been very persistent. She was clearly distressed and desperate for help. So, mostly just to be kind and to end the conversation, Patricia had given the woman her phone number. Almost immediately after, Bérengère had sent her a couple of texts, but Patricia had intentionally ignored them, filing it away as just another likely dead end. But now, 8 months later, here was Bérengère again, texting her with this bizarre and dramatic message about a castle calling for her. For some reason, this time, it was different. Maybe it was the strange wording of the text, or maybe it was just the fact that Patricia had a rare day off with nothing else to do. Whatever it was, her interest was piqued. She found herself feeling a strange sense of inspiration, a little pull of curiosity. She decided she would actually follow up on this one. She was going to go check out this castle and see for herself what this supposed haunting was all about. About an hour and a half later, Patricia's car pulled up in front of a small, charming cottage. The cottage was situated on the same large property as the castle. From her earlier brief text exchange with Bérengère, she knew this was where the woman lived. Patricia parked her car, got out, and walked up the stone path to the front door. She knocked firmly, then waited. There was no answer. The air was still and quiet. After a few moments of silence, she knocked again, this time a little louder. A moment later, the door creaked open. But the person standing in the doorway was not Berenger. It was a middle-aged man, and he looked completely confused to see a stranger standing on his doorstep. The look on his face was one of pure bewilderment. Seeing his confusion, Patricia immediately launched into an explanation. She said, "Hello, I'm looking for Berenger. I'm Patricia." We were just speaking via text message. The man just continued to stare at her, his expression not changing. He seemed to have no idea what she was talking about. It was an awkward and uncomfortable moment. But then, from behind the man, Berenger appeared. As soon as Berenger saw who was at the door, her entire demeanor changed. Her face flooded with relief, and her eyes welled up with tears. She looked like she was about to start weeping with joy. She rushed forward, pushing past the man. "Oh my gosh, thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is unbelievable. Thank you. We really need your help." Before Patricia could even ask a question or get a word in, Berenger gestured towards the confused man who had opened the door. By now, his expression had softened a little, though he still looked a bit lost. "This is my husband, Remy," Berenger said. "And he is just as relieved as I am that you're here." At this, Patricia offered the man a polite smile and shook his hand. She turned back to them both and said, "Well, I don't know yet what I can do for you. Why don't you start from the beginning and fill me in? All I really know is that you believe the castle over there is haunted. Can you tell me the story?" Berenger took a moment to compose herself, wiping a tear from her eye. She took a deep breath and then began to explain. About a year ago, her husband, Remy, had been hired as the full-time caretaker for the historic castle on the property. As part of the job, they were given free housing in this very cottage. She had come along to help him with the upkeep. At first, she said, they were both thrilled. It was a wonderful opportunity, a beautiful place to live, and a steady job for Remy. But their excitement didn't last long. Berenger told Patricia that they had only been living and working there for a couple of weeks when the strange things started to happen. She explained that she would often be in the castle by herself, doing her daily chores like cleaning or dusting. She would know for a fact that she was the only person inside the huge, empty building. And yet, she would suddenly hear the clear and unmistakable sound of footsteps, people walking, and sometimes even running around on the floors above her. At this point in the story, Remy chimed in, speaking for the first time. He said, "Yes, I've heard it too. I've heard those same footsteps, and I know the castle is totally empty." He looked at Patricia with wide, earnest eyes. "But it's even stranger than that," he continued. He said he would be working inside the castle and he would hear voices. And he wasn't talking about faint whispers that you might hear in a movie. No, he would hear people screaming at the top of their lungs. The screams would come from distant, unseen parts of the castle, and he said it was absolutely terrifying. As Patricia listened to Remy and Berenger tell their story, she was struck by how genuinely frightened they were. They weren't being dramatic or trying to sensationalize anything. It was clear that whatever they had experienced inside that castle had deeply shaken them. They seemed trapped. Remy's job required him to be there, to go inside the castle every day, but it was becoming an increasingly difficult and stressful ordeal for both of them. They felt like they had nowhere to turn and that no one would take them seriously. Patricia couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for them. They came across as honest, ordinary people who were caught in an extraordinary and frightening situation. But at the same time, her professional skepticism was still there. She was a veteran in these matters. She had been on numerous house calls to supposedly haunted locations. She knew that screams could be the sound of the wind whistling through a crack in a window, and footsteps could be a raccoon in the attic or a pet walking around somewhere else in the house. There could easily be a rational explanation for everything they were describing. But their fear was so palpable, so real, that she knew it warranted a closer look. There was enough here to convince her that she needed to see the castle for herself. So, after they finished their story, she looked at them both and said, "Okay, let's go over there." Let's go see the castle. A few minutes later, Patricia was following Berenger and Remy along a wooded path that led from their cottage to the castle. Even from a distance, the castle was an imposing sight. It was huge and intimidating, with two very tall round towers on either end. In the middle was a slightly shorter section, decorated with a cluster of smaller turrets that reached up towards the gray sky. The front of the castle, the side they were approaching, only had two visible windows. For a fleeting second, as Patricia looked up at them, she had an uneasy feeling that the windows were like two giant eyes, and the castle itself was watching her approach. She quickly shook the feeling off, telling herself not to get carried away, and kept walking. A few moments later, they arrived at the castle's massive front door, which was made of thick, dark wood. Remy pulled out a huge, old-fashioned key ring that was heavy with dozens of keys. He found the right one, inserted it into the lock, and turned it with a loud, metallic clank. Then he pushed the heavy door open and stepped aside, gesturing for Patricia to go inside first. Patricia took a steadying breath, trying her best to remain professional and objective. She was not going to buy into the hype just yet. This could still be something completely normal. But as she stepped over the threshold and into the castle, she found herself in an enormous, empty space known as the Great Hall. The first thing she noticed was how incredibly dark and cold it was inside. Of course, it was an old stone castle, so a certain level of cold was to be expected. But this felt different. It was an eerie, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air itself felt heavy, thick, with a kind of oppressive silence. It was not a welcoming place. It was the kind of place that made you want to turn around and leave immediately. Patricia took another deep breath, trying to center herself and focus on the task at hand. She looked around the Great Hall more closely. There were a few windows on the far wall, but their heavy wooden shutters were all closed tight, plunging the room into shadow. Directly in front of her was a grand, sweeping stone staircase that led up to the upper floors. To her right and to her left, she could see long, dark hallways that she knew must lead to dozens of other rooms. After a few moments of just taking it all in, Patricia turned to Berenger. She said, "Okay, so you mentioned you've heard footsteps upstairs when you knew this place was empty. Can you remember what you were doing on any of those occasions? What were you doing the last time you heard the sounds?" Berenger thought for a second and then nodded. "Actually, yes, I do remember," she said. "The last time it happened, I was closing the shutters on those windows over there. And I know I heard people walking around upstairs while I was doing that." Instantly, Patricia's practical mind went to work. That could be it. Maybe the sound of the old heavy shutters moving was creating some kind of echo or vibration that in this cavernous space could be mistaken for footsteps. It was a plausible theory. "Okay," Patricia said, "let's go test the shutters. Let's just see if that could be causing the strange sounds you're hearing." Berenger and Remy didn't seem offended by her suggestion at all. In fact, they seemed eager to find a rational explanation for what was happening. They wanted it to be something simple. So, the three of them walked over to one of the large windows. Patricia reached out, grabbed the wooden handles of the shutters, and pulled them open. Then she pushed them closed. She did this a few more times, listening carefully. But there were no strange sounds. There was the creak of the old wood and the thud as they closed, but certainly nothing that could be confused with the sound of footsteps running around upstairs. It was a dead end. This was not the explanation. Still, just to be thorough, Patricia decided she would try one of the other shutters. Maybe one of them was faulty or made a different noise. She walked over to the next window and reached for the shutter. But before her hand even made contact with the wood, a loud, sudden, high-pitched shrieking sound echoed through the entire castle. It seemed to come from somewhere high above them on one of the upper floors. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, and the castle was plunged back into a deadly, unnerving silence. Immediately, the hairs on the back of Patricia's neck stood on end. It was an unmistakable sound, a human-like shriek of terror or pain. She turned to look at Remy and Berenger. They were both frozen, their faces pale with fear. They had obviously heard things like this before, but it was clear that it was just as terrifying every single time. Patricia stood there for a moment, her heart pounding, not sure what to do next. She forced herself to stay calm. Wait a minute, she told herself silently. That couldn't have been what it sounded like. There has to be a logical explanation. Part of the reason for her skepticism was that even in all her years as a psychic medium, she had never experienced anything so direct, so visceral. A ghostly scream was something you saw in movies, not something that happened in real life. So she turned to the terrified couple and said in a calm voice, "Look, I obviously heard that too. But let's not rule out that it could have been the wind or something else. Let's not jump to conclusions here. Let's be rational, let's be pragmatic. Let's just search the castle and see what we're dealing with." Remy and Berenger did not look reassured in the slightest, but they nodded meekly, willing to follow her lead. But before anyone could move, before anyone could even take a step, it happened again. Another sudden, loud, high-pitched scream ripped through the silence, this time from a different location upstairs. It sounded like a different voice. And then, once again, it was gone, leaving only a ringing in their ears and a thick, heavy silence. At that moment, it became very clear to Patricia and certainly to the couple that this was not the wind. The castle might just be haunted after all. There was something very wrong happening here. As Patricia stood there, trying to process what was happening and figure out what their next move should be, because she was now, by default, the expert in charge, a powerful and strange feeling came over her. She would later describe it as a pull, like a magnet was inside her, pulling her in the direction of where the screams had come from. She felt an overwhelming and undeniable urge to go upstairs, to the second floor, to find the source of those sounds. She felt like she had to. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was a compulsion. She wasn't even sure if it was her own psychic abilities kicking in, or if it was the castle itself drawing her deeper into its shadows. Without saying a word to Remy and Berenger, without even a glance in their direction, Patricia silently turned and began to walk, almost as if against her will, towards the huge stone staircase that led to the upper levels. The castle was now completely silent again. The only sound was the soft echo of their own footsteps on the stone floor as they moved towards the stairs. Remy and Berenger, their faces masks of terror, huddled closely behind Patricia, following her lead, not knowing what else to do. Up the stairs they went. Patricia was still in the grip of that intense feeling, that pull that she couldn't control. Up and up the stone steps she climbed, with the frightened couple close behind. No one spoke. The only sound was their breathing and the scuff of their shoes on the stone. They went all the way up to the third floor, which is where she felt the screams had most likely originated. At the top of the stairs, Patricia, acting almost on instinct, turned to her left and started walking down a long, dark hallway. The hallway was lined with closed doors on either side. Again, the castle was unnervingly quiet. All they could hear was the sound of their own footsteps echoing in the narrow space. Down the long hallway they walked, all the way to a dead end. And at the very end of the hallway, there was a single closed door. At this point, Patricia, almost as if she were a different person, turned and spoke to Remy in a sharp, almost aggressive tone. "Get your keys out," she commanded. "Open this door." She didn't even know why she was being so forceful. The words just came out of her. Berenger, however, spoke up, her voice trembling. "The owner of the castle," she whispered. "They told us this is the one room we are not allowed to go in. We've never been inside. We can't go in there." Patricia just looked at her, her expression unyielding. "I don't care," she said, her voice firm. "We have to go in. Open the door. I'm going in. I have to go in this room." Berenger looked at her husband, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Remy just gave a slight shrug. They were in way over their heads and had no idea what to do. They figured they had to trust Patricia. She was the expert after all. So Remy pulled out his big ring of keys again. He fumbled through them, his hands shaking slightly, trying to find the right one. Patricia stood there, practically vibrating with the need to get into that room. She couldn't understand the feeling, but it was all-consuming. Finally, Remy found the key. He reached out, put it in the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open, and Patricia immediately walked inside. As the door swung open, Remy and Berenger got their first look inside the forbidden room. And it was completely unremarkable. It was just a vacant, empty room. There was no furniture, no decorations, nothing at all. There was no obvious reason why this specific room would be off-limits. But as they stood in the doorway and watched Patricia walk slowly and methodically to the center of the room, they could have sworn they heard the faint sound of whispers suddenly starting up inside the empty space. Patricia came to a stop in the very middle of the room, her back facing them. And then things got even stranger. Patricia, who was now acting very differently from the calm professional who had first arrived, just stood there, rigid, staring towards the back wall of the dark room as the whispers seemed to grow louder. From their vantage point in the doorway, Berenger and Remy watched in horror as Patricia's body began to twitch. Her shoulders moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and her neck snapped to the side at a strange angle. And then she began to let out a horrible, croaking sound. It was a constant, single-tone, guttural noise. It went on and on for so long that it seemed impossible. She should have needed to take a breath to continue, but she didn't. The sound just emanated from her, relentless and unsettling. Remy and Berenger were now terrified, not of the castle, but of Patricia. As she was twitching and croaking, she suddenly stopped, whipped around, and faced them. Her mouth was hanging open, her jaw completely slack, and that awful croaking sound was still coming out of her. But they could also see that she was weeping. Tears were streaming down her face. Remy and Berenger were beyond terrified, but they could also see that Patricia was in some kind of crisis, and they wanted to help. They were just about to ask her what was wrong, what they could do, when a loud slamming sound echoed up from one of the lower floors. It sounded like a heavy door had been slammed shut with incredible force. The noise seemed to snap Patricia out of whatever trance she was in. Her expression changed in an instant. She became focused, alert. And then, without a word to the couple, she bolted right past them, sprinted out of the room, and ran down the hallway and down the stairs. She was chasing after the sound. Remy and Berenger looked at each other, stunned. What else could they do but follow her? So they ran down the hallway, several paces behind Patricia, who was already somewhere on a lower floor. They got down to the second floor and could hear movement coming from one of the rooms down the hall. Then they heard a loud, almost animalistic yelling sound. It seemed to be Patricia, yelling or growling or something from inside one of the rooms. They cautiously made their way in that direction and saw an open door that led into a bedroom. Off of the bedroom was a small bathroom. They went into the bedroom and looked into the bathroom. And there was Patricia. Her back was to them, and she was on her knees, weeping uncontrollably. She was looking up at something in the room, something they couldn't see. They could see her face from an angle, and it was contorted in pure horror. She was looking at something that was terrifying her, but to them, the bathroom was completely empty. Remy and Berenger didn't hesitate. They rushed into the bathroom and grabbed Patricia. She seemed to resist, not wanting to leave, but they were stronger. They dragged her out of the bathroom, pulled her to her feet, and literally, forcibly, removed her from the castle out into the fresh air. Several hours later, Berenger and Remy were back inside their cozy cottage. They were sitting in their living room, with stacks of old papers and historical documents scattered all over their coffee table. Sitting with them was Patricia. By this point, she was mostly back to her normal self, but she was still visibly shaken by what had happened inside the castle. She was now able to explain to the couple what she had experienced from her perspective. She told them that she had, in fact, gone into a kind of trance, a psychic medium experience unlike any she had ever had before. This was on a completely different level. It was visceral and terrifyingly real. According to Patricia, when she had walked into that locked, forbidden room on the third floor, the room was not empty for her. When she was pulled in there, what she saw was a room filled with people, entities, or ghosts. Berenger and Remy couldn't see them, but Patricia could. She said they were all wearing different kinds of clothes, from different time periods. There were people dressed in medieval peasant outfits, women in Victorian dresses, and men in 20th century business suits. But the most powerful impression she got was not their appearance, but their emotional state. She could feel how lost and scared these spirits were. They seemed to be in trouble. Patricia said she felt like she was pulled into the center of the room and then anchored there, unable to move. As she stood there, these ghosts began to crowd in on her, getting closer and closer, as if they were desperately trying to get her help. She felt overcome by a suffocating, claustrophobic feeling. It wasn't their physical presence that was overwhelming her, it was their sadness. Their collective loneliness and desperation washed over her in waves, and it was so powerful and so awful that it made her weep uncontrollably. Eventually, she said, she was able to force her body to turn around and at least look towards the exit. That's when she heard the loud slamming door from downstairs. The sudden noise seemed to startle the spirits, and they backed away from her, which gave her the chance to bolt from the room. Patricia then explained that when she ran out and started heading in the direction of the slammed door, the feeling of being pulled was very different. The pull that had led her up to the third floor had felt neutral, maybe even positive, like something was guiding her to help. But this new pull, leading her down to the second floor, felt totally different. It was dark. She knew that something evil was pulling her towards it. But still, almost against her own will, she ran down the hallway, down the stairs, and into that bedroom, with Berenger and Remy following behind. When she went into the bathroom, she saw something so terrifying that she just collapsed to her knees and began to scream. That was the animalistic wailing that the couple had heard. What she saw was an enormous, tall, Guzek figure. It was the ghost of a man, covered in deep scars, wearing rusted chainmail armor, like a knight from a long-forgotten time. She said he radiated pure evil. It was a dark, malevolent presence. She knew that was the source of the dark feeling that had pulled her there. She felt like it was trying to pull her to her death, and she believes that it was only because Remy and Berenger came in and physically pulled her away that she was able to escape. After Patricia finished her incredible story, the three of them sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. They had to figure out what it all meant. They quickly decided to focus on the most immediate threat, the evil entity, the tall man in the rusted armor. Who was he? And what did he want? Berenger and Remy had already gathered up a bunch of historical documents about the castle, and they had spread them out on the coffee table. Together, they started going through them, looking for any clue that might explain who this terrifying spirit could be. As they were looking through the old papers, one particular section caught Patricia's eye. She felt a strange pull towards it, a feeling that she needed to read it. It was a section about a knight named Jean who had lived in the 14th century. The document said that Jean had been a soldier during the 100 Years' War, a long and brutal conflict between England and France. During that war, the castle had been used as a French military fortress, and Jean, the knight, had been killed in a battle that took place right there at the castle. After Patricia read this out loud, she told Berenger and Remy that she just had a feeling. She couldn't explain why, but she was certain that the evil spirit she had seen in the bathroom, the tall man in the armor, was the ghost of Jean. However, even if she was right, it didn't solve their problem. They still didn't know why he was there, why he had appeared to her, or why any of this was happening, and who were all the other ghosts in the room on the third floor. None of it made any more sense. Berenger eventually looked at Patricia and asked, "What do you think all this means? What do we do?" But Patricia was still deeply shaken. She was a renowned psychic, but she had never experienced anything this intense. It was truly terrifying. She just shook her head and said, "Look, I'm overwhelmed. I need to go home. I need to go home and just think about all of this. I need to process what happened here." Remy and Berenger were obviously disappointed, and probably terrified at the thought of being left alone with the haunted castle, but they understood. They couldn't force her to stay. So, Patricia got up and left, leaving them alone with their fear. After she was gone, Berenger and Remy made a pact. They agreed that even though it was Remy's job to look after the castle, it was just too dangerous to go inside for now. They would stay away, at least until Patricia came back and they could figure out what to do. For the next couple of days, life was surprisingly normal for them. As long as they stayed away from the castle, nothing strange happened at all. They just lived in their cottage and tried to go about their lives. But Patricia didn't call, and she didn't come back. She was at her own home, trying to come to terms with her terrifying experience. And during this time, Berenger started to feel a strange sensation in her chest. It was a feeling of needing to go to the castle. It was a pull, very similar to what Patricia had described. She tried to ignore it, to fight it, but the feeling just grew stronger. She felt this undeniable compulsion to go over there. Then one day, Remy was looking out the window of their cottage, and he saw his wife, Berenger, walking purposefully across the lawn, straight towards the front door of the castle. He knew immediately what was happening. He thought there's no way she should be going in there. We agreed. He ran out of the cottage, raced over to her, and literally grabbed her and pulled her back just moments before she could go inside. When he pulled her away, she seemed to snap out of it, and she couldn't even explain why she was there. She just said, "I don't know. I just felt like I had to come over here." But that wasn't even the strangest thing that happened in those few days. Shortly after that incident, a random man had wandered onto the castle grounds. He didn't seem to know why he was there, but he too was being drawn towards the castle. As this man was walking towards the front door, a deer, which also seemed to be drawn to the castle, came running out of the woods and rammed into the man with incredible force. He was injured so badly that he had to be hospitalized, and he actually lost an eye in the incident. After this happened, Berenger and Remy knew they couldn't wait any longer. They had been trying to give Patricia her space, but things were escalating. The dark energy in the castle seemed to be getting stronger, its influence spreading. They had to get in touch with her. Berenger called Patricia and told her everything that had happened. She said, "Whatever's going on in that castle, whatever dark energy is in there, it's getting stronger." At first, Patricia was not eager to return. She had made a conscious decision to stay away. The experience had terrified her, and she didn't want any part of it. But as she listened to Berenger on the phone, she could hear the sheer desperation in her voice. Berenger and Remy were at their wits' end. They were lost, and they were turning to her not just as a psychic, but as a friend. They needed her help. So, reluctantly, Patricia agreed to go back. The following evening, the three of them were back inside the castle. They were standing in the second-floor bathroom, the very same room where Patricia had encountered the terrifying entity she now believed was the ghost of Jean. Patricia had come back to attempt an exorcism. She stood in the middle of the small bathroom, while Berenger and Remy huddled together behind her near the doorway. Berenger was so scared she was physically shaking. They watched as Patricia, despite her own fear, stood there calmly with her eyes closed. She was trying to channel the energy in the room to connect with the spirit of John. After a few moments of silent concentration, Patricia seemed to connect with something that Berenger and Remy couldn't see. The room was empty to them, but it was clear that Patricia had found what she was looking for. Then, out of nowhere, her voice boomed through the small bathroom, loud and stern. "Jean, show yourself." Berenger and Remy stared at her, their hearts pounding. Patricia opened her eyes and looked around the room, and then her gaze locked onto something on the other side of the bathroom. She could clearly see something that they couldn't. Patricia, her eyes still fixed on whatever was in the room with them, spoke again in that same loud, commanding voice. "It's over," she said. "You have to move on." She was speaking directly to the entity, to Jean, telling him that his time was up. For a long moment, there was just silence. Berenger and Remy held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Was Patricia going to go into another trance? But she remained calm, forceful, and anchored to the spot. Nothing happened. It was completely silent. Then Patricia repeated her command, her voice even stronger this time. "It's over. You have to move on." And this time, after she spoke, they all heard it. The sound of banging on a door coming from the third floor directly above them. Then they heard the sound of shuffling footsteps, dozens of them, all over the place. And then the sound of mournful crying. There was more banging. Berenger and Remy clutched each other, terrified. But Patricia remained unmoved, a rock in the center of the storm. And then, suddenly, they heard the distinct sound of a door flying open upstairs. This was followed by the sound of all those footsteps rushing down the hallway, mixed with the sound of crying. But the crying had changed. It was no longer sad. It sounded like blissful crying, like tears of pure joy, as a crowd of spirits charged down the hallway, down the stairs, and out of the castle forever. And then, just like that, it was over. A profound calm fell over the entire castle. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere was gone. Patricia turned away from whatever she had been looking at in the bathroom and faced Remy and Berenger. She was smiling. "It's over," she said softly. "It's okay. Everything's okay now." Patricia later explained to them what had happened. She had been able to channel the ghost of Jean. He had been haunting the castle because he didn't know he was dead. He was stuck in a kind of purgatory, believing he was still fighting the 100 Years' War. For centuries, every time someone died in or around the castle, he would take their spirit and hold it prisoner in that locked room on the third floor. But when Patricia had told him it's over, he understood that she meant the war was over. And at that moment, Jean himself was the one who freed all the prisoners. That was the sound they heard, all the spirits being released, joyful and free at last. And then Jean's own spirit was finally able to find peace and move on. But there is one final strange twist to this story. A short time after the exorcism, when life had returned to normal for everyone, Patricia and Berenger were talking on the phone. At one point in the conversation, Patricia said offhandedly, "You know, Berenger, it's a good thing you texted me again and got me to come back out there. Clearly, I was able to help." "What a good thing it was that you texted me." And Berenger replied, "What do you mean?" Patricia said, "You know, when you texted me that the castle was calling me." "You were right." "It was, and I came over and we took care of it." But Berenger was confused. She said, "I haven't texted you in months. I didn't send you that message." Patricia, surprised, pulled out her phone and found the text. She read it back to Berenger. "The castle wants you. The castle is calling you. Come." And Berenger insisted, "Yeah, I didn't send that to you." And to this day, Patricia, Berenger, and Remy still have no idea who or what sent that fateful text message to Patricia's phone. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. As dawn broke on the 5th of February, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlone stood in her Wilsonville, Oregon apartment kitchen. The small apartment smelled like coffee, even though the sun wasn't up. Morning stillness was Laverne's favorite time. The only time she had the flat to herself and could breathe was then. She resided there with boyfriend John Sosnovsky. John always left before morning to take his bus to work at a local mill, where his shift started early. Laverne was relieved every time the front door closed behind him, like a weight had been removed. Since John wasn't home, Laverne could pretend her life was normal. She might act safe. She was merely acting for herself. Indeed, John was violent. He was severely physically abusive, especially when drunk, which was almost constantly. His fury was a regular storm in their home that Laverne had to navigate. Her first husband died of cancer. After his death, she met John when she was lonely and weak. She didn't realize John's true nature until she was already ensnared in his web. 10 long years. 10 years of treading on eggshells, hiding bruises, and dreading his key in the door. Laverne still lacked the guts to quit. She was afraid of what he would do if she attempted. He made it plain what would happen. Thus, she felt absolutely trapped at home. She made coffee and sat at her modest kitchen table that morning. As usual, she unwrapped the local paper. Her first sight was a large black-and-white photo of a young woman on the front page. The woman smiled, looking vibrant in her 20 seconds. The snapshot accompanied a murder story. About 30 miles northeast of Portland, it happened. Tanya Bennett was the victim. The smiling girl was Tanya Bennett. The article said she was viciously battered and strangled with a rope. Highway side, her body was left. Laverne got a chill reading about Tanya's discovery. That article indicated her body was dumped near a prominent scenic viewpoint. This place was familiar to Laverne. She'd been there before. About 1.5 miles from the lookout. Her mental image of the region was excellent. Laverne sat there, her coffee cold, her eyes flitting between the words on the page and Tanya's beaming face. As she watched, a thought formed. She felt strangely familiar with this horrific deed. She initially couldn't place it. She continued staring at Tanya's eyes in the photo. Then her brain switched on. She was sure she knew who did this when everything fell apart. John, her boyfriend, had probably killed this woman. Laverne got up from the table, even though she loved her quiet mornings. Her hands shook. She contacted the cops from her kitchen's wall-mounted phone. Laverne felt like her heart would explode after hanging up the phone. She was shivering uncontrollably. She took a huge risk. She didn't know if the police could arrest John with the information she gave them. If not, John would likely learn she called if they questioned and released him. He discovered she betrayed him and told police she thought he was a killer. If that happened, his abuse would worsen. She had no idea what he would do to her. Her view was that there were only two outcomes. She could either sever her relationship with John and send him to prison for a long period, or she could wind up like Tanya Bennett, another dead girl on a highway. On the morning of February 16, Detective John Ingram sat on a couch in a spotless Wilsonville, Oregon living room. He and his partner were in Laverne's apartment. As the lead investigator on the Tanya Bennett murder case, Ingram spoke with Laverne, who was sitting on the couch opposite him. She appeared anxious. She couldn't sit still, fidgeted, and gave him and his buddy coffee and water 3 times. Something was clearly on her mind. Ingram knew this woman had tipped a week before. Susan told the dispatcher she thought her boyfriend, John Sosnowski, killed Tanya. Now, Ingram was here to hear the whole story. He wanted every detail she could give because his case was hopeless. This Laverne tip was their only lead. Tanya's body was located on a grassy slope near the highway, where vehicles could see her. Yet, Ingram and his crew found no eyewitnesses. Several people claimed to have seen Tanya at a bar the night she disappeared. Nobody could describe the man she was with. Just a man. Ingram and his companion followed the rules. They contacted everyone who knew Tanya. They canvassed her neighborhood door to door. They interviewed her family, co-workers, and acquaintances. Despite that, they had no suspects. The crime scene provided scant evidence, making matters worse. They had no useful fingerprints, physical evidence, or forensics to identify a killer. In this clean apartment, Ingram was betting everything on Laverne. He hoped she would give him the case-opening key. He tried to smile at her to reassure her. "When you're ready, tell me what you know. Explain why you think John killed Tanya." Laverne initially squirmed in her seat. It was obvious she was nervous. Ingram advised her to breathe deeply and relax. He told her that was okay, they wanted her narrative. "Finally," she said with a trembling voice. She informed them John had come home late the night of the murder, possibly around 1 or 2 in the morning. He immediately entered the bathroom and showered. She said this was unusual. John didn't take 2 morning showers. It wasn't his habit. Laverne didn't think much of it at the moment. My understanding came the next day. They were at a local tavern when she overheard John. She heard John brag about murdering Tanya Bennett at the pub. He detailed how he picked her up at a truck stop, killed her, then drove her body to the highway by the Columbia River Gorge to dump her near that gorgeous viewpoint. Ingram and his companion looked at Laverne as he told the story. It surprised them. Laverne effectively overheard a confession. Her details matched what the cops knew. Tanya was observed late at night with an unknown male. Yes, her body was recovered near that gorgeous overlook. Although the body's location had been reported, hearing it as part of this confession was powerful. Perfect poker face, Ingram kept his face neutral. He nodded and calmly advised Laverne to keep on and tell him everything. So Laverne continued. She said she was afraid to speak up. John frightened her. She called him a violent alcoholic who abused her often. She stated this helped her believe his confession. That John could kill someone didn't surprise her. Violence was a daily threat to her. She was terrified he would murder her if she told anyone. So she hid this dreadful secret for days. But then she saw the newspaper article. Tanya seemed young and innocent in the photo. Laverne said she felt she owed the girl to speak up, no matter the risk. Ingram's mind was racing. If Laverne was right, this was a major case break. This may solve everything. This may have been Tanya Bennett's complete narrative. However, as an experienced detective, he understood he only had one woman's story. Even though she was convincing, he couldn't trust her. He needed tangible proof. So he requested Laverne to let him search the apartment. When Laverne nodded, the two investigators got up and started work. The detectives followed Laverne down a small hallway to the master bedroom. Once there, she stood by the doorway and let the men work. The detectives divided instantly. Ingram's colleagues started on one side of the room and Ingram on the other to maximize efficiency. Ingram presented a list of items they wanted to locate that could link a suspect to the crime site. A little denim swatch was crucial. It was Tanya's pants' front buttoned part. This portion was missing when they found her body. Interestingly, it was cut out cleanly. It made Ingram suspect the killer took a trophy or keepsake. Ingram didn't find the denim patch after several minutes of digging through the bedroom. At first sight, he saw no connection between John and Tanya. A cardboard box with old documents sat in the corner, so he went there. The random letters and receipts were sorted by him. He found it then. He took out a damaged scrap of paper. A handwritten message was there. "Good piece, T. Bennett." Ingram froze. He instantly summoned his partner. His partner looked down at Ingram's note as they crossed the room. Both realized the significance. T. Bennett must be Tanya Bennett. This was huge. They glanced at each other and thought the same. John needed to be talked to immediately. The door opened as they exited the bedroom and walked to the front door to leave the flat. The gateway was manned by John Sosnowski. Detective Ingram was at the sheriff's interrogation table an hour later. John sat across. Although he was confused, John appeared calm for a man who had just found two detectives in his bedroom. Ingram introduced himself and explained why they were at the flat when John entered. John seemed astonished, but didn't argue. He readily consented to answer questions at the station. However, Ingram was an experienced detective. He realized that cooperation didn't prove innocence. Sometimes it implied the reverse. Ingram passed John a Tanya photo across the table. He asked if he knew her or was involved in her murder. John didn't rage, not denying it. He didn't seem alarmed by the inquiry. He said he didn't remember after looking at the picture. Ingram then showed him the T-written note they found in his bedroom. "Good piece, Bennett." John glanced at the page and wasn't sure if he wrote it. Simple, direct questions needed. Simple, direct responses. Ingram was suspicious that John couldn't answer them clearly. The interview continued as usual. No matter what Ingram asked, John would just give these vague, non-committal answers. He struggled to answer yes or no questions. Ingram was struck by John's nonchalance during the interview. He pretended to talk about the weather while being questioned about a terrible murder. This was no time for laziness. This was a time to be honest and defend yourself. Despite his gut sense and intense suspicion of John, Ingram realized his sole proof was circumstantial. A bizarre note and girlfriend tale. It was insufficient to arrest him for murder. They sought concrete proof linking John to Tanya. After the weird interview, Ingram groaned and told John he could leave. 4 days later, Ingram's desk phone rang when he arrived to work. He was astonished to hear Laverne's voice when he answered. Before he could ask why she was phoning, Laverne said she found something in her car that morning. She believed he needed to see it. And when she told him, Ingram instructed her to stay and he would be right over. He went to find his partner after hanging up the phone. His heart raced as he drove to Laverne's flat. The past several days were frustrating. No fresh evidence proved John was their killer. One piece of evidence was lost. The note in John's box of papers was useless. Their forensics lab couldn't identify John's handwriting, so they couldn't prove he wrote it. Based on what Laverne told him on the phone and what she found in her car, Ingram was almost certain this was the break he had been waiting for. Ingram and his partner met Laverne in her garage within an hour. All eyes were on her car's trunk. Laverne told Ingram she kept her car and life spotless. Her car and apartment were clean. Nothing was out of place. A little denim swatch was in her car trunk when she went out that day. She was certain she hadn't put anything there. With her suspicions of John and his link to the murder, she immediately thought she should report it to the police. As they gazed into that trunk, Ingram and his companion felt struck. The trunk's clean carpet held a little denim square with buttons. It matched the denim they were secretly seeking. A crime detail was kept from the public. Outside the investigation, no one knew the killer took Tanya's jeans portion. They found it in their primary suspect's girlfriend's car. This needed to be their break. That was Tanya's jeans denim. The call by Laverne was correct. This was huge. Naturally, Ingram understood they had to follow process. A lab test would be needed to determine that the denim swatch matched Tanya's jeans when she died. It could have been a coincidence from Laverne or John's jeans. But the conditions were too ideal. It felt like winning the lottery. Ingram watched his companion use tweezers to gently place the swatch in an evidence bag and seal it. They assured Laverne they would examine it immediately and contact her. Ingram reviewed their findings at his desk the next morning. They felt wealthy at this time. After locating the denim, they summoned John back for a polygraph test the night before. He failed totally. In his report, the test administrator stated that John knew what happened to Tanya. Ingram awaited one more piece of the puzzle. He awaited the lab's confirmation that the fabric matched. Once he got the call, they might arrest John. Then his phone rang. He grabbed it immediately. It was Lab. Ingram straightened his chair, anticipating good news. The other technician sounded down. He told Ingram that Laverne's automobile denim swatch didn't match Tanya's jeans. It wasn't hers. Ingram was stunned. He sat silently. The idea that they located the same unique denim cut in their prime suspect's residence by chance seemed absurd. Denim swatches from the front of jeans weren't common. It was too specific. There must be more to this story. Ingram attempted to figure out why the swatch was in her car, but nothing made sense. The only plausible reason was denim planting. As the thought hit, Ingram felt shocked and frustrated. He felt like he was starting over after thinking he was close to solving this case. He knew his next stop. He needed another Laverne conversation. Later that morning, Ingram and his colleague sat in Laverne's living room again. Laverne sat across from them, worried. But this time, Ingram would do things differently. He would punish her more. He knew her previous story was false. After sitting down, Ingram asked her directly. He stared her in the eye and asked if she planted that denim in her car. As soon as he said that, Laverne's face fell. After quivering her lower lip, she cried. She sobbed and apologized. She admitted to doing it. She chopped up an old pair of jeans and put the buttons in her automobile. She lied about finding it to get enough proof to arrest John. She was frightened when they let him leave after the first interview. She knew John killed Tanya. He had mentioned it to her. She wanted the cops to hold him accountable because he was dangerous. Ingram could tell she was sincere as she spoke. This woman was clearly afraid of John and feared he was a murderer. Even if planting evidence was wrong, he wanted to believe her motive. She had a major problem with her story. He knew Laverne was still concealing things. Because without inside knowledge of the crime site or other facts, she could not have planted that exact denim cut. Missing something. Why did she arbitrarily choose the front button fly of a pair of jeans to plant evidence? The pic seemed too detailed to be random. When he asked Laverne how she knew to cut that piece, her energy changed. The crying ceased. Sadness and regret vanished. It was replaced by hesitation. She seemed unsure how to react. It appeared she was caught. Then Laverne inhaled. She looked at Ingram and said, "I lied. You're right. My story about planting evidence was false." However, she claimed she lied out of fear. She worried the cops would arrest her if they learned the whole truth. Then Laverne detailed what she said happened to Tanya Bennett. Laverne alleged John called her the night Tanya was murdered. He sounded frantic. He informed her he was in trouble and to meet him at the bar. He instructed her to bring a shower curtain. Laverne said she didn't ask questions because John scared her. So she did as he said. She drove to the bar with a shower curtain from their bathroom. John was in the parking lot when she arrived. He stood over a corpse. It was Tanya. She lay unmoving on the cold pavement. Shocked, Laverne said. She had no idea what to do. She helped him. She helped John lift Tanya into her car trunk. The shower curtain she brought was wrapped around her. They drove to the highway and discarded her body at the picturesque overlook. Laverne's story darkened as she spoke. She later admitted that Tanya was alive when she arrived at the parking lot. She claimed Tanya was barely surviving. Laverne restrained Tanya's neck with a rope at John's request as he sexually attacked her. Laverne reported Tanya stopped breathing when he finished. Ingram was stunned as he listened. This gentle, soft-spoken elderly woman was suddenly telling him she actively engaged in the sexual assault and murder of a young woman. It was hard for him to comprehend. Ingram only thought, this can't be real. Laverne's claim fit. It clarified everything. It explained John's cagey interview answers, failed polygraph test, and, most crucially, how Laverne knew about the denim. She knew what area of Tanya's trousers to cut out and put as phony evidence because she and John had cut them originally. Despite this life-changing revelation, Ingram wanted to be sure this horrific, detailed account was true. And he knew how to prove it. The next day, Ingram drove his police cruiser. Laverne sat in the back, peering out the window, while his partner was in the passenger seat. They were driving northeast of Portland on the freeway. When they reached where she and John dropped Tanya's body, Ingram told Laverne to tell him. The newspapers had reported the body's broad location, but not its actual position. Ingram understood that if Laverne could pinpoint the place, she was telling the truth. Ingram's heart rate increased as they approached the spot. He maintained his speed. He didn't slow down or signal their approach. He kept driving straight, waiting for Laverne to speak. Laverne didn't say a thing as the cruiser drove by Tanya's body. They continued driving silently for a few minutes. Disappointed, Ingram was. This story seemed like another falsehood. Laverne suddenly spoke from the back seat. She said, "Hold on. Turn around." Ingram found a space to turn the car around, and they headed back. This time, Laverne yelled out as they passed the crime scene, the slope where Tanya was found. She claimed that was her location. "Stop." Ingram looked at Laverne as he pulled over to the shoulder. She stared out the window at the body's location. They exited the automobile together. Laverne crossed the road and pointed down the grassy slope to where Tanya had been found. Ingram was astonished. Laverne was honest. Her choice of location would have been difficult without having been there before. She must have participated. Ingram felt they had all they needed as they got back in the car. The evidence was sufficient to arrest John and Laverne. She had come forward, but now she would pay the price. Just 16 days after Laverne made her first anonymous contact, John Sosnowski was arrested on February 21. Laverne Pavlone was arrested 5 days later. Both were charged with murder. Laverne's trial began 11 months later. Laverne sought to amend her tale again. She sought to retract her statement, saying she hadn't done anything. The jury didn't believe her. She received a life sentence for murder. 2 months later, John received the same sentence, life in jail. The case should have ended there. But Detective Ingram couldn't stop thinking about it for 3 years. He kept thinking about Laverne, John, and Tanya Bennett. Though Laverne had done wrong, he felt weird pity for her. She was clearly controlled by John and afraid of him. But more than that, Ingram had this terrible, persistent sensation that they had messed something. Ingram was in his office one March 1994 afternoon when his desk phone rang. The prosecutor handled Tanya's case. The prosecutor said they received a bizarre Tanya murder letter. The prosecutor explained the letter's contents, making Ingram queasy. Ingram was correct to worry. The legal system botched this case. He felt loose and incorrect about Laverne. Their star witness was not a nice, older woman terrified of her abusive lover. She had not spoken the truth despite the implications. That was not her tale. She lied about practically everything to Detective Ingram and his partner. Laverne wanted to break up with John but was terrified. To get rid of him, she devised a complicated and deadly strategy. She framed him for murder. Initially, she excelled. She read every newspaper item she could find to memorize Tanya's murder's facts. She discovered the missing denim swatch by sneaking a look at Ingram's list of evidence during her first apartment interview. Some was dumb luck. She predicted where the body was located on the highway, but she was right. Her strategy failed because she accidentally implicated herself in framing John. She believed that the police would sympathize with her and perceive her as a victim of John's deception, resulting in his arrest. But that didn't work. She was convicted of murder and imprisoned with him. Laverne and John were serving life sentences for a crime they didn't commit when the true perpetrator, the man who murdered Tanya Bennett, wrote to the authorities admitting. That was the letter the prosecutor called Ingram about. Laverne and John were released in 1995 after the true killer was arrested. Laverne's falsehoods got them 4 years in prison. 71-year-old Patrice Miller stood in front of her refrigerator in her little home one morning in early November 2023. She lived in rural Downeyville, California. Since she was running low on a few products, she ordered from the local market. They delivered her groceries, which was great. Patrice needed food delivery at this point. She lived alone and found housework harder as she aged. She was also having health issues, making movement difficult. Even with a walking stick, she navigated the house. Patrice heard one of her 2 cats meowing outside the door while she was making her grocery list. This prompted her to feed them. Thus, she delayed her list. She headed out the door with her walking stick after closing the fridge and pouring cat chow into a bowl. Patrice brought her porch cat food bowl. She had other outdoor tasks, but her walking stick limited her to 1. She returned inside to retrieve her kitchen compost bin after setting up her cat's feeding bowl. She returned to her garden. She finished these outdoor duties fast because she didn't like being outside anymore. She had lived in Downeyville for years, but it had become unsafe. Since she stayed to herself, she didn't realize how awful it was. She eventually heard from her neighbors that their properties were being invaded. Vandalism had increased, with yards messed up and residences broken into. After a few months, Patrice started experiencing it. After so many attempted break-ins at her house, she was convinced she had a stalker. She even installed metal bars on all her windows for security. Patrice disliked the outdoors because of that. She felt exposed and weak. She believed her stalker was following her and might attack her. She quickly dumped the compost in her garden, turned around and ran inside, locked the door. Once inside her residence, she breathed a great sigh of relief. A few days later, on November 8, Cassie Coe, a 55-year-old cashier, was counting up a client at Patrice's usual market. She bagged their stuff while thinking about something else. Patrice was on her mind. After years of delivering Patrice's groceries, Cassie had become more than a client and delivery lady. Friends? They frequently called to catch up. Cassie noticed she hadn't heard from Patrice in days. This was odd because of their closeness, and since Cassie knew Patrice hadn't ordered in long. Cassie asked throughout the store, but no one had heard from Patrice. Cassie knew Patrice could be busy. Just about anyone else wouldn't worry about a missing order. Cassie was especially worried because she knew Patrice's stalker. She knew Patrice had phoned the police, but they weren't helpful. This tiny rural hamlet was inundated with these calls. Burglaries, harassment, vandalism. Nobody had reported actual violence yet. Thus, local officials were inundated with small complaints. Patrice's condition wasn't worse than anyone else's, but the sheriff's department weren't staffed to investigate them all. They only advised Patrice on house security, so she put window bars. Cassie knew Patrice was afraid of her stalker, whom she called Big Bastard. She worried about what he would do next. Cassie called Patrice again after her shift. Cassie phoned the police for a wellness check after failing to locate her. A Sierra County Sheriff's Department deputy parked in front of Patrice's house that evening after driving up the lengthy driveway. He knew something was wrong immediately. The house's front door was broken and hanging off its hinges. It seemed like a garden hose had been left on the porch stairs, pouring water everywhere. The deputy exited his cruiser and approached the residence. He turned off the water at the house's side spigot. Then, he climbed the porch's front stairs. He scanned the area for sounds as he moved. He had no notion if the house was still dangerous or what he was entering. He looked through a window before entering through the smashed front door to see what was going on. Blood was his first sight. Just inside the door, blood covered the floor. He unholstered his gun. The deputy entered the residence through the broken entryway with his revolver. He slowly walked across the living room, listening for movement or evidence of someone. But the house was quiet. No one was intruding, but Patrice was missing. The blood in front of the home was all he saw. The deputy went from living room to kitchen. After crossing the threshold, he paused. The room was completely disorganized. All cabinet doors were open. The floor was covered in food, packing, and broken glass jars. The kitchen's far-end window was destroyed, and Patrice's security bars were bent and twisted, dangling on their hinges. The deputy initially missed what was on the floor in the center of the kitchen due to the clutter and devastation. Once his brain digested the sight, he understood he was gazing at Patrice. What was left of her, she no longer appeared human. Her body was mangled. The deputy fled the residence and reported his horrible discovery. Patrice's property was filled with police, crime scene technicians, and forensic experts within an hour. Detectives spoke to Patrice's neighbors as they spread out. The authorities quickly profiled Patrice's killer because practically everyone in the neighborhood had been experiencing the identical break-ins and property damage. The killer was the same person pestering everyone else, they concluded. The police couldn't figure out why. Why did Patrice face such serious violence while everyone else simply experienced minor vandalism? Police were reconstructing Patrice's last day's movements while searching for her killer. At first, they were stuck. It appeared she had only done basic duties that day. They discovered two minor details that explained everything as they investigated those chores. Patrice has been making two bad blunders every day for 2 years. She fed her cats on the porch and dumped her compost in the garden. Big Bastard, her stalker, came to her home because of these two innocent activities. A black bear named Big Bastard. His favorite foods were cat food and kitchen garbage. He eventually considered Patrice food. The bear waited as Patrice fed her pets and emptied her compost for the last time in early November 2023. After waiting until Patrice was asleep, it broke into her house and brutally killed her. The deputy arrived at her home after days of the bear returning and eating Patrice's remains. Black bears rarely attack. Patrice was California's first black bear fatality. The disaster was caused by such absence of perceived risk. Because of this, officials didn't help Patrice or her neighbors with bear complaints. They wondered, what could go wrong? Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. On a warm afternoon, the 23rd of June 2014, a 49-year-old man named Patrior hurried out of a hospital in Sète, France. He was a janitor there, and his shift had just ended at 4:30 p.m. As he rushed towards the parking lot, he was fumbling with the buttons on his fresh-collared shirt. He was clearly in a hurry, not wanting to be late. He got to his scooter, climbed on, and gave his watch a quick, anxious glance. He was definitely behind schedule. He lifted the kickstand and gunned the engine, speeding off into the busy traffic. Horns blared around him as he weaved between cars, but Patrior didn't care. He was late for a date, and right after that, he had to get to his daughter's dance recital. These two events were bright spots in what had been a very long, very dark period in his life, and he was determined not to miss a second of either. For Patrior, things hadn't been going well for a very long time. About 8 years earlier, he'd fallen into a deep rut of binge drinking and heavy gambling. It was a destructive cycle that cost him almost everything. One day, while he was drunk, he struck his wife. That was the final straw. She divorced him, and in the process, he lost custody of his beloved daughter, Alabama, who was now 12 years old. After the divorce, Patrior's life continued its downward spiral. He ended up moving in with his elderly mother. His drinking only got worse, and his gambling habit consumed nearly every cent he earned from his janitor job. Things got even more complicated when he started an affair with a married coworker. When her husband discovered the affair, the situation ended in tragedy. The woman died, and her death was ruled an apparent suicide. That had been 5 years ago, and the trauma of it all had left a deep scar on Patrior. He'd barely dated since then. He had pretty much accepted that he was going to be alone for the rest of his life. But then, a few weeks before this day in June, his phone rang. It was the woman he was now racing to meet, a woman named Audrey Liu. He was so late now, he was genuinely worried she wouldn't wait for him. So, he twisted the throttle on his scooter, flying across an intersection and ignoring another chorus of angry horns. He had known Audrey for a long time. They had met right after his divorce and had gone out a few times, but they eventually just lost touch. She was quite a bit younger than him, and back then she had a habit of standing him up. But she was also fun, and it had been ages since Patrior had felt the excitement of a date. So when she called him out of the blue, saying she wanted to see him again, he immediately said yes. They had made plans to meet that afternoon at a park near his hospital. It was a well-known spot, with a big rocky hill rising up behind it. The views from the top were some of the best in the city. On one side, you could see the vast expanse of the ocean, and on the other, dramatic cliffs that were dotted with ancient caves. They wouldn't have much time together, maybe just enough for a short walk before he had to leave for Alabama's recital. But Patrior was hopeful. He hoped that the romantic setting might be enough to spark something between them again. A few minutes later, he pulled up to the park entrance. And to his immense relief, Audrey was still there, waiting for him. He parked his scooter, locked his cell phone away in the underseat compartment, and walked over to her. He could see a nervous smile on her face, and it made him feel like she was just as excited as he was. That gave him a little boost of confidence. He took her hand, and together they started walking down the path. The next morning, around 8 a.m., about 10 miles up the coast from that park, Patrior's older brother, Mark E. Wire, was on the deck of his boat. He was a fisherman, and he was busy pulling a large oyster trap out of the water. As he worked, his phone started ringing. He set down the trap and answered it. Before he could even say hello, he heard his mother's voice, and it was filled with worry. She asked him if he knew where Patrior was. Mark frowned. This was a strange question. Patrior lived with their mother, so she should know his whereabouts better than anyone. But his mother quickly explained that Patrior hadn't come home last night. He also wasn't answering his phone, and he hadn't shown up for his shift at the hospital that morning. But then she mentioned the most concerning thing of all. He had missed his daughter's dance recital the previous evening. This was the detail that made Mark's blood run cold. He knew how much Patrior adored his daughter. He had been talking about that recital for weeks. There was no way he would have missed it willingly. Mark knew then that something was seriously wrong. He promised his mother he'd figure it out. He hung up the phone and immediately started calling Patrior's friends. With each call he made, his worry grew. No one had seen or heard from Patrior since yesterday afternoon. The last anyone knew, he had left work around 4 p.m., but he hadn't told anyone where he was going. Mark felt a knot tightening in his stomach, but he knew he had to start somewhere. Patrior's work seemed like the most logical place. He steered his boat back to the dock, tied it off, jumped in his car, and headed towards the hospital. 4 hours later, Mark was standing on a rocky lookout point, the same one that overlooked the park where Patrior was supposed to have his date. He was scanning the city of Set below him. The hospital where Patrior worked was in the middle of the business district, a busy area full of canals, cafes, and tourist spots. Mark and a few of Patrior's friends had spent the entire morning combing through these places, checking one by one, but they had found no sign of him. So Mark had decided to check the more remote areas around the city, like this hill behind the park. But still, there was nothing. Mark was trying to think of any other place his brother might have gone when his phone rang again. It was one of the friends who was helping with the search. He had just found Patrior's scooter. It was parked outside the entrance to the park at the bottom of the hill, just a short drive from where Mark was standing. Mark told his friend not to touch anything. He sprinted back to his car, sped down the hill, and pulled into the parking lot. And there it was. Patrior's scooter, parked just as his friend had said. Mark stared at the scooter, then at the quiet, empty park surrounding him. A cold, heavy weight settled in his stomach. He couldn't think of a single logical reason why Patrior would have left his scooter here overnight. All day, a nagging fear had been in the back of his mind, a worry that something terrible had happened to his little brother. But now, seeing that scooter, that fear became a certainty. Almost 2 weeks later, at 8 a.m. on the 5th of July 2014, Detective Boris Fryer took an exit ramp towards the French town of Set. The morning sun hit his windshield, and he had to squint as he looked out at the scenery. It was a beautiful place, with long stretches of beaches and canals, all framed by those same rocky cliffs. Fryer was a senior investigator from the nearby city of Montpellier. He had been called in to take over a missing persons case that had the local Set police completely stumped. The case was that of 49-year-old Patrior, who had vanished nearly 2 weeks ago after going on a date with a woman named Audrey Liu. The local police had already spoken to Audrey. She told them she had no idea what happened to Patrior. She said they went for a walk, he escorted her to her bus stop, and then she assumed he just went back to his scooter and went about his evening. But his scooter was found the next day, right where he'd left it, and Patrior was nowhere to be found. Now, 2 weeks had passed, and there was still no sign of him. Patrior's brother Mark had been very involved, trying to help the investigation in any way he could. Fryer had spoken to Mark on the phone, and Mark had painted a picture of his brother as a saint. A man who would drop anything to help a friend, who never got into fights, and who had no enemies to speak of. But Fryer was a seasoned detective, and he was skeptical. In his experience, people who just vanish off the face of the earth are often victims of foul play, either kidnapped or murdered. Of course, he had no concrete reason to suspect that yet. It was just as possible that Patriar had gotten into an accident, maybe fallen off one of the cliffs, or maybe he had chosen to disappear. At this point, what Fryer needed to do was start from scratch. He had to dig into who Patriar really was and figure out if there was a reason someone might want him gone. A few minutes after arriving in set, Fryer was sitting in the living room of Patriar's ex-wife, a woman named Claude. They both sat down and Fryer switched on his recording device. He started by asking Claude where she was on the day Patriar went missing. She said it was a completely normal Monday for her. After work, she picked up their daughter, Alabama, from school and drove her to her dance recital. She said she had fully expected to see Patriar there. It had really surprised her when he didn't show up. She told Fryer that despite all of Patriar's flaws, and he had plenty, he was a good father. He wouldn't have missed that recital. At the mention of his flaws, Fryer leaned forward. This was exactly what he needed to know about. He didn't suspect Claude of anything. She had a solid alibi and no real motive. But he thought she might be able to shed some light on any habits or troubles that could have led to Patriar's disappearance. When he asked her about this, Claude hesitated. She said she didn't want to speak ill of him, but she admitted that he drank and gambled far more than he should have. Fryer pressed her for more details, but Claude insisted that Patriar had always kept that part of his life very separate from her and their daughter. But then she paused, thinking for a moment. She said there was someone who might know more. And with that, she called their 12-year-old daughter, Alabama, into the room. The young girl came in, and she was visibly shaken and nervous about everything that was happening with her dad. Her mother, Claude, took her hand gently and encouraged her to tell the detective her story. Slowly, Alabama began to speak. She said that about a week before her dad disappeared, he had taken her on a very strange errand. He had parked outside of a tunnel and told her to wait in the car. Then he got out and walked into the dark tunnel to meet someone. She said it was a man, but it was too dark for her to see his face or any features. But she clearly saw her father hand the man some kind of package. After the exchange, her father turned and ran back to the car. She said he seemed really scared. Afterwards, he refused to tell her who the man was or what the meeting was about. All he would say was that he had done something really stupid, and because of it, he now owed some people a lot of money. After Alabama finished her story, her mother thanked her and sent her back to her room. Once she was gone, Fryer asked Claude if she had any idea who the man in the tunnel could be. Claude said she didn't know. But she did have one name that she thought was worth looking into. She explained that this wasn't someone who would have lent Patriar money. Instead, it was a man who held a deep personal grudge against him. His name was Remy Shen, and he was a local hairstylist. An hour later, Fryer was sitting in a cramped cubicle at the set police station, scrolling through a file on his laptop. He had run Remy Shen's name through the police database, and just as Claude had suggested, he found an immediate connection to Patriar. Back in 2009, a few years after Patriar's divorce, he had been questioned as a witness in the suicide of Remy Shen's wife, a woman named Nadesh Shen. Nadesh had worked with Patriar at the same hospital. The report stated that Nadesh had come home one night after a work party and confessed to her husband, Remy, that she had been having an affair with Patriar. The couple had a massive argument that lasted for hours. Nadesh ended up sleeping on the couch while Remy went upstairs to their bedroom. The next morning, Remy found Nadesh in their garage. She had hanged herself. As soon as Fryer finished reading the report, he knew he had his first real suspect. He looked up Remy's last known address and phone number. Around 10 a.m. the next day, July 7th, Fryer led Remy Shen into an interrogation room and shut the door. Remy was a short, wiry man. He had a scowl on his face that made it perfectly clear he felt this was a huge inconvenience. Fryer immediately got the sense that Remy was the type of person who would only crack under intense pressure. So he decided to go on the offensive right away. He tried to shake Remy by telling him they knew he was involved in the kidnapping of Patrioir. It was a complete bluff. Fryer had no evidence at all. But he wanted to see how Remy would react. To his surprise and frustration, Remy just laughed. He acted like he had no idea who Patrioir even was. When Fryer brought up his late wife, Nadesh, and the affair she'd had with Patrioir, Remy just scoffed. He reminded the detective that his wife's death had been 5 years ago. He said he had moved on, that he was dating other people. He argued that it was absurd to think he would hold a grudge for 5 years without doing anything, only to suddenly decide to take revenge now, out of the blue. It just didn't make any sense. Fryer wasn't sure what to make of him. Remy seemed incredibly confident, almost too confident. So Fryer changed tactics and simply asked him where he was on June 23rd, the day Patrioir went missing. After thinking for a moment, Remy said he had spent the whole afternoon alone cleaning out a storage unit he had rented. It was a terrible alibi, easily faked. But with nothing else to go on, Fryer had no choice but to let Remy go. As he watched Remy walk out, Fryer knew he was running out of time. 2 weeks had already passed. Every day that went by, the chances of finding Patrioir alive grew slimmer. Out of desperation, he decided to go back to the very beginning of the timeline and speak with Audrey Liu one more time. As the last person known to have seen Patrioir, Audrey was an obvious person of interest. The local police had already questioned her, and Fryer had watched the tape of that interview several times. He wasn't sure what more he could possibly get from her, but he knew he had to try. He picked up the phone and asked Audrey to come back to the station. Later that same afternoon, around 2 p.m., Fryer had been across from Audrey in the same interrogation room. He started the recorder and asked her to go over her history with Patrioir again. At first, her story was exactly the same as it had been on the tape. She said they met 8 years ago in 2006, dated for a little while, and then lost contact. A few weeks ago, she said, she happened to walk past the bar where they had their first date, and it made her think of him. So, she called him up, and they made plans to meet. She described their date as a short walk in the park. Afterwards, Patrioir walked her to the bus stop, and she assumed he went back to his scooter to head to his daughter's recital. That's when Fryer interrupted her. He asked her to tell him, specifically, which direction Patrioir had headed in after he left her at the bus stop. Audrey just sat there for a long moment. Then she said, I can't remember. This answer really bothered Fryer. Here was the one person who should have been able to give him the most information about Patrioir's final moments, and she was offering nothing useful. So Fryer dropped his polite tone and went after her hard. He told her he wasn't buying her story. He said she needed to tell him everything she knew right now or things were going to get much worse for her. Audrey's eyes went wide. Her voice started to shake as she insisted she had already told him everything. But Fryer didn't let up. He kept pushing, demanding that she admit what she had done, until he was practically shouting. Audrey broke down in tears, repeating over and over that Patrioir was fine when she left him, she just couldn't remember all the little details. Finally, Fryer backed off. He had conducted countless interrogations in his career, and his gut was telling him that Audrey's fragile state wasn't an act. He had pushed her as hard as he could, and he had to consider the possibility that she was simply telling the truth. A little while later, after Audrey had left, Fryer sat alone in the interrogation room, thinking. He hadn't ruled out any of his suspects. He still had no idea who the mysterious man in the tunnel was. And on top of all that, there was still a chance that no crime had even been committed. They didn't have a body. For all he knew, Patrioir could have just walked away from his life. There were just too many unknowns. Fryer knew that if this case was ever going to move forward, they needed to find Patrioir, dead or alive. Around 11 a.m. on July 17th, 3.5 weeks after Patrioir disappeared, Detective Fryer parked his car on the shoulder of a winding road in Set. He got out, ducked under a line of yellow police tape, and walked across a long stretch of dry grass that led up to a sheer cliff wall. About a dozen yards ahead, he could see the dark, round opening of a cave, barely visible against the rock face. A few hours earlier, a group of teenagers had walked into the police station. They seemed very shaken up. They said they had found a human body inside that cave. As soon as Fryer heard this, he rushed to the scene. The cave was less than half a mile from where Patriore's scooter had been found. Fryer switched on his flashlight and stepped inside the cave. A forensics team followed close behind him. Together, they made their way into the darkness. The flashlight beam revealed walls covered in graffiti, and the floor was littered with empty bottles and trash. It looked like a popular hangout spot for local kids. As they moved deeper, the main cave split off into a maze of narrow tunnels. Fryer was just about to tell his team to spread out and search each one when he passed a tunnel that had a foul, overpowering smell coming from it. He stopped and aimed his flashlight down that specific tunnel. He saw a shallow pit that had been dug into the floor. And lying at the bottom of the pit was what looked like a ragged lump of black fabric. But as Fryer stepped closer, he knew it wasn't fabric. The smell was overwhelming now. He was standing over the charred remains of a human body. He knelt down to get a closer look and immediately saw what appeared to be a bullet hole in the skull and another in the torso. These details, one shot to the head, one to the stomach, and the body being burned afterwards to destroy evidence, felt disturbingly familiar to Fryer. It looked like a professional, mob-style hit. A year and a half later, just before Christmas of 2015, Detective Fryer was in his office in Montpellier when his phone rang. It was Mark, Patriore's older brother, calling again to ask for an update on the case. Fryer sighed. The truth was, he had nothing new to tell him. The body in the cave had been confirmed through DNA to be Patriore. Fryer had hoped that finding the body would open up new leads, but it hadn't. They had scoured the cave for clues, tested cigarette butts found at the scene for DNA, and re-interviewed the teenagers who found the body, but the case had hit a complete dead end. The execution-style killing did fit with the theory that Patriore had been killed over a gambling debt. But Fryer had never been able to find any evidence that Patriore owed anyone that kind of money. He also still hadn't identified the man in the tunnel that Alabama had seen. That left Remy Shen and Audrey Liu as his only two suspects. Fryer had placed both of them under surveillance, but so far neither had done anything suspicious. The investigation was completely stalled. Fryer understood that Patriore's family was losing patience. So he wasn't surprised when he told Mark there were no new developments, and Mark just snapped. He told Fryer that if the police weren't going to solve this, he would take matters into his own hands. 3 months later, on a night in March of 2016, Detective Fryer sat down on his couch to watch television. Mark had followed through on his threat. He had convinced the producers of a national true crime show to do an episode on his brother's case, and it was airing tonight. As the show began, Fryer felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Mark knew details about the investigation that were not public knowledge. If he shared them on national television, it could seriously compromise the entire case. But a part of him was also curious, and he hoped that maybe, just maybe, renewed public attention could help. As he watched, Fryer was relieved. Mark wasn't there to talk about the specifics of the investigation. He was there to talk about his brother. He described Patriore as a hardworking father who had just never been able to catch a break. A man who, at the very least, deserved justice. At the end of his segment, Mark made a simple, heartfelt plea for anyone with any information to please come forward. When the show ended, Fryer didn't feel worried anymore. Nothing sensitive had been revealed. But he also didn't feel very hopeful. He thought the chances of anything coming from this were incredibly small. He was wrong. The next morning, his phone would ring. And an hour after that call, Fryer was ringing the doorbell of an apartment in Lunel, a town not far from Set. A woman answered the door. When Fryer showed her his badge, she let him inside. The woman's name was Sophie. She had called the police after watching the true crime show, saying she had information about Patriore's case. Fryer followed her into her kitchen, sat down at her table, turned on his recorder, and told her to start from the beginning. And as her story unfolded, Fryer knew the case was finally solved. Based on all the evidence and witness testimony, police were able to reconstruct what they believed truly happened to Patrior Ewire on the afternoon of Monday, the 23rd of June 2014. At 4:30 p.m., the killer stood on that rocky hill overlooking the park in Set. They were watching through a pair of binoculars as Patrior and Audrey walked hand in hand down the path below. The couple was taking their time, enjoying the beautiful scenery and each other's company. At some point, Audrey stopped and pointed across the road towards the entrance of one of the caves in the nearby cliffs. When the killer saw this, their heart began to race. They watched as the couple crossed the road, walked up to the cave, and disappeared inside. The killer lowered the binoculars and placed them in a large duffel bag they were carrying. They slung the bag over their shoulder, hurried down the hill, and went straight to the cave entrance. When they got there, they put the bag on the ground and unzipped it. They pulled out a large rifle, a roll of duct tape, and a plain white mask. The killer put on the mask. With the rifle in one hand and the tape in the other, they entered the cave. They could hear Patriar and Audrey's voices inside. They hadn't gone very far in. They were so wrapped up in their date that they had no idea someone else was there. But as the killer got closer, the couple heard the footsteps and turned around. When Audrey saw the masked figure with the rifle, she started to scream. Patrior's face went pale. Before they could do anything, the killer threw the roll of duct tape at Audrey and told her that if she wanted to live, she would do exactly as she was told. The killer ordered Audrey to use the tape to bind Patrior's wrists and ankles. For a moment, Audrey just stood there, completely frozen in shock. But then, she complied. As she taped Patrior's hands and feet, he just stood there, silently, in stunned disbelief. When she was finished, the killer told her to get out of the cave and not to say a word to anyone about what just happened. She hesitated for a second, glancing back at Patriar, but then she turned and ran. Once her footsteps had faded, it was just the killer and Patriar alone in the cave. Patriar stared at the masked figure, wondering what was about to happen. The killer made intense eye contact with him, raised the rifle, and shot him once in the head and once in the chest. Patriar crumpled to the ground. The killer then slung the rifle over their shoulder, grabbed Patriar by the ankles, and dragged his body down one of the narrow tunnels, dumping him in that shallow pit. Then, they took out a canister of lighter fluid they had brought in the bag and doused the body. They lit a match and tossed it into the pit. As Patriar's body began to burn, the killer walked out of the cave. As soon as they were back in the daylight, they pulled off their mask. There was only one thing left to do now: find Audrey, explain everything, and make sure she didn't go to the police. Because the killer was Remy Shen, the hairstylist who had hated Patrior for 5 years for the affair with his late wife. And he had just tricked Audrey into helping him commit murder. It turned out that Audrey was actually Remy's ex-girlfriend. They had started dating in 2009, shortly after his wife's death. Remy had realized that because Audrey also had a history with Patriar, he could use her to lure Patriar into a trap and finally get his revenge. But Audrey was not a willing accomplice to murder. She claims she didn't know Remy was going to kill Patriar. Remy had fed her a sob story, telling her that Patriar owed him a lot of money. She believed they were just going to scare Patriar into paying it back. It wasn't until they were in the cave and Remy showed up with a mask and a rifle that she realized his intentions were far more sinister. After the murder, Remy kept Audrey silent by threatening to kill her and her children if she ever told anyone. For over a year, she kept his horrific secret, lying to the police the entire time. But when she saw that true crime episode and heard Mark's desperate plea for information, she finally cracked. She confessed everything to her friend Sophie, who she was watching the show with. And Sophie did the right thing. She called the police the very next day. On the 31st of March 2016, Remy Shen and Audrey Liu were arrested for their roles in the death of Patriar. Remy received a sentence of 30 years in prison for murder. Audrey was sentenced to 12 years for being an accessory to the kidnapping. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya! One morning in 2017, 25-year-old Watanabe Takuya walked through the front doors of Keio University Hospital in Tokyo, Japan. He wasn't panicking and he wasn't asking for help right away, but something about him immediately felt off. His skin was drenched in sweat from a fever. A deep headache pulsed behind his eyes with every step he took. And as he approached the check-in desk, he kept one hand tightly pressed against his right ear. Fluid was leaking from it. For most people, symptoms like that would have been terrifying. But Takuya mainly felt annoyed, because this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him. Takuya had a long and difficult history with a condition known as cholesteatoma. It's basically a non-cancerous skin cyst that grows deep inside the ear canal, and it can cause a lot of problems if it's not treated. When Takuya was just a teenager, he'd had to go through multiple surgeries to get these cysts removed. The doctors had worked hard to make sure they got every last bit of it so it wouldn't come back. And for nearly a decade, it seemed like they had succeeded. The surgeries had worked. The cysts were gone, and he had been able to live a normal life without constant ear problems. But then, about 2 weeks before this hospital visit, the old, familiar symptoms started to return. He noticed a constant drainage coming out of his right ear. It was a clear sign that the cyst was back. Initially, Takuya had tried to ignore it. He was busy with work and life, and the idea of going back to the hospital, of possibly facing another surgery, was something he just didn't want to deal with. He put it off, hoping it might just clear up on its own, even though deep down he knew that was unlikely. But now, with the fever and the pounding headache, he couldn't deny it any longer. He was pretty sure the recurring cyst had caused him to develop a nasty ear infection. That would explain why he felt so sick. And so, here he was, back at the hospital, hand pressed to his ear, feeling frustrated with himself for waiting so long. He walked up to the check-in desk and explained his symptoms and his medical history to the receptionist. She listened patiently, nodded, and typed all his information into the computer. Seeing the state he was in, she quickly had him admitted to the emergency room. About half an hour passed. Takuya was now lying in a bed in the emergency room. The bright, sterile lights of the room were so intense they felt like they were stabbing into his eyes, making his headache even worse. So he just kept his eyes closed. But even with his eyes shut, he could hear the quiet sounds of the ER, and he sensed a doctor standing right beside his bed. He listened as the doctor began to go over the results of the initial tests they had run. The doctor's voice was calm and professional. He confirmed what Takuya had already suspected. Based on his medical history and the fluid clearly leaking from his ear, they were almost certain that his cyst had returned and had led to a severe ear infection. The doctor then mentioned that it was very likely Takuya would need another surgery to get rid of the cyst once and for all. But then the doctor's tone shifted slightly. He said they didn't want to operate just yet. There was a bigger, more immediate problem they had to deal with first. The preliminary blood tests had shown something alarming. The doctor explained that Takuya's ear infection had become so bad that the infection had actually started to spread to the tissue surrounding his brain. This was an extremely dangerous development. It could lead to meningitis, permanent brain damage, and even death if it wasn't treated aggressively and immediately. When Takuya heard this, his annoyance and frustration were instantly replaced by a cold wave of shock and fear. This was far more serious than he had ever imagined. But more than anything, he just felt angry at himself. He knew, with a sinking feeling, that if he had just come to the hospital 2 weeks ago when the drainage first started, the infection likely never would have gotten this bad. He had tried to avoid the problem, and now it had spiraled into something life-threatening. It was too late for regrets now. Takuya forced his eyes open, squinting against the painful light, and looked at the doctor. He asked what they could do. The doctor laid out the plan. They were going to admit him to the hospital, not just keep him in the ER, and start him immediately on a very powerful intravenous dose of antibiotics to fight the infection that was threatening his brain. 2 weeks later, Takuya was still a patient in the hospital. He was lying flat on his back, being slowly rolled into the large, white, donut-shaped ring of a CT machine. The machine would scan the inside of his head, giving the doctors a detailed picture of what was going on. By this point, the powerful antibiotics had done their job. The dangerous infection around his brain had been cured, his fever was gone, and his headache had finally subsided. He was feeling much better. But despite this progress, one symptom remained. His ear was still leaking fluid. It wasn't constant anymore, but it was still happening on and off, a sign that the root problem was still there. And so, the doctors had ordered this CT scan. Their goal was to look inside Takuya's head, pinpoint the exact location and size of the suspected cyst, and map out exactly how they were going to approach the surgery to remove it. Takuya laid perfectly still for about 5 minutes as the CT machine whirred and clicked around him, taking hundreds of images of his skull and brain. When it was finished, a nurse helped him out of the machine and led him back to his hospital room to wait. A little while later, one of the hospital doctors came into his room holding a folder with some papers inside. The doctor told Takuya that based on the results of the CT scan, he had some good news. Takuya actually didn't need another surgery on his ear. For a moment, Takuya felt a huge wave of relief wash over him. He had been mentally preparing himself for another operation, and the news that it wasn't necessary was incredible. But that happy feeling only lasted for a second. He saw the doctor's expression shift. The professional calm was gone, replaced by a deeply troubled look. The doctor then explained the reason why he didn't need surgery for a cyst. It was because there was no cyst in his ear at all. The real problem, the actual cause of all his symptoms, was something much, much worse. The doctor pulled an image from the stack of papers and handed it to Takuya. It was a cross-section from his CT scan. When Takuya looked at it, he could not believe what he was seeing. It would turn out Takuya had an extremely rare condition called Gorham-Stout disease, which is more commonly known as vanishing bone disease. It is a mysterious and devastating illness where the body's own systems, for no known reason, begin to break down and absorb its own bone tissue. In Takuya's case, the bones of his skull were literally disappearing, dissolving away almost like an ice cube melting in the sun. And that fluid that had been leaking out of his ear for weeks, it wasn't from an infection. It was cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that cushions the brain, which was now flowing out through the holes that were forming in his skull. Unfortunately, then and now, there is no known cure for Gorham-Stout disease. The best doctors can do is try to manage the symptoms and patch the damage as it occurs. And that's exactly what they did for Takuya. Surgeons went in and used a special kind of biomedical glue to literally plug up the holes that were forming in his skull. Amazingly, the procedure seemed to work. Takuya's doctors monitored him closely for any further bone loss and fluid leakage. As of his most recent publicly released checkup in 2018, he appeared to be doing quite well. One afternoon in late January of 2018, a father named Dan Levitas stood inside the bathroom that his 3 kids shared in their house in Madison, Wisconsin. With a sigh of frustration, Dan grabbed his kids' toothbrushes from the holder by the sink and threw them straight into the garbage can. Then he picked up a bottle of disinfectant spray and went to work, spraying the counters, the sink, the faucet, the mirror, basically every single surface he could see, and began wiping everything down with paper towels. Dan was doing this deep clean because his entire family, himself, his wife, and their 3 young children all had strep throat. Their family doctor had explained that the best way to get rid of it for good was a 2-pronged attack. Everybody had to take a full course of antibiotics, and they had to deep clean the house from top to bottom to get rid of any lingering bacteria that might have caused the infection. However, as Dan scrubbed down the bathroom counters, he felt a deep sense of frustration. This was not the first time his family had gone through this exact routine. This was not the second or third time either. Over the past 4 months, his entire family had come down with strep throat a staggering 6 times. And no matter how many antibiotics they took, or how many times they threw out their toothbrushes and deep cleaned the entire house, it felt like the sickness always found a way to come back. It was a miserable, unending cycle. This was especially baffling to Dan because he was actually a biologist. He understood bacteria and how infections spread better than most people. He had already gone through a mental checklist of every possible source for this recurring infection. He checked at his own workplace and his wife's, but nobody else was getting sick. He checked with his kids' school and their daycare, and again, no other children or staff members were repeatedly getting strep. So he knew the infection couldn't be coming from any of those places. This just didn't make any sense. If the source wasn't outside the home, it had to be inside. But each of the 6 times they got sick, Dan and his wife had been incredibly thorough. They had systematically disinfected the entire house, going far beyond just the bathrooms. They cleaned every doorknob, every light switch, every toy, every surface they could think of. If there was strep bacteria hiding somewhere in the house, it surely should have been wiped out by now. It was as if the bacteria was somehow surviving their cleaning blitz, hiding in some place they had never thought to look. He just couldn't figure out where it could be. But regardless, Dan still dutifully finished disinfecting the bathroom for the 6th time. When he was done, he went to the kitchen. On the counter was a small pile of prescription bottles, antibiotics for the whole family. Dan took his own dose and then prepared the doses for everyone else. He went to his daughter's room first. His 2 girls, who were 6 and 3 years old, were both lying in their beds, looking completely miserable and flushed with fever. He gave them their medicine before heading to his and his wife's bedroom. He found his wife sitting up in bed, and she was cuddling their very sick 1-year-old son. Dan handed his wife her antibiotics and then looked down at his son. The little boy looked so small and so vulnerable, and it just broke Dan's heart to think about how many times this poor kid had been sick in his short life and how powerless he, as a father, felt to protect him. Dan felt like they were doing everything right. They were following the doctor's orders to the letter, but they were now on their 7th round of illness, and clearly nothing was changing. The advice they were getting wasn't helping. It felt like they were trapped in an awful nightmare they couldn't wake up from. But then, as Dan stood there feeling utterly defeated, he thought of something. His own mother was a retired pediatrician. She had decades of experience, and maybe, just maybe, she might have a different perspective or some advice that their current doctor hadn't considered. So, he sat down on the edge of the bed, took out his phone, and called his mom to explain the situation and ask for help. And it turned out Dan's mom did have a theory. It was a theory about where this relentless strep bacteria was coming from and how to finally get rid of it. But because Dan was a biologist and he understood how bacteria functioned on a scientific level, he knew that his mother's theory was, to put it mildly, out there. Most scientists and medical professionals would probably say that her idea was basically impossible. But at this point, after 6 bouts of strep throat, Dan and his family were desperate. They were ready to try anything, no matter how unconventional it seemed. So, Dan decided he would try to test his mother's theory. He began looking for an expert who could help him. But every expert Dan got in touch with, every lab and every doctor he called, turned him down as soon as they heard what his theory actually was. Nobody was prepared to even entertain the idea. It felt like he was so close to finding an answer, to finally curing his family of this horrible problem, but he was being blocked at every turn because the medical community wouldn't even consider it as a possibility. About a month later, in early March, Dan was inside a hospital room sitting next to his wife. They were both staring down at their 3-year-old daughter. She was lying in a hospital bed, looking tiny and frail, hooked up to an IV drip and wearing an oxygen mask. She had gotten strep throat for the 7th time. And this time, it was much worse. She had gotten so sick that she had also developed pneumonia. At this point, Dan and his wife weren't even sure if she was going to survive. For Dan, this was the absolute breaking point. He was on the verge of a complete breakdown. He was convinced that the only way to save his children was to find someone, anyone, who would be willing to test his mother's theory. But they had already been turned down by basically every expert in the entire state of Wisconsin. Dan had no idea who else to turn to. As they sat there in the tense silence of the hospital room, watching their little girl fight for her life, Dan's wife suddenly turned to him. She had an idea. What if, instead of asking established medical professionals for help, they tried asking medical students? Maybe a student, someone more open-minded and not so set in their ways, would be more willing to test out a theory, even if it did seem kind of crazy. Dan agreed. It was a long shot, a final Hail Mary, but it was definitely worth a try. They reached out to the University of Wisconsin, and this time their desperate plea actually worked. On the 4th of April 2018, about 6 months after the first strep outbreak in their house, Dan and his wife took one very specific thing from their home and brought it to the University of Wisconsin. The student they had contacted agreed to analyze it. And after the analysis was complete, the results determined that Dan and his family's crazy theory was correct. It would turn out that Dan, his wife, and their 3 kids were not the only ones in their home suffering from strep throat. There was actually a 6th victim, their pet cat. Now, most veterinarians at the time didn't believe that cats could even catch the specific strain of strep that affects humans, let alone transmit it back to them. That's why all the professionals had refused to even test the family's cat. It went against everything they had been taught. It was not until Dan contacted the University of Wisconsin's veterinary school that a student finally agreed to run the test. And lo and behold, the test came back positive for the exact same strain of strep bacteria that the family kept catching. Their beloved cat was the carrier, constantly reinfecting them after every round of antibiotics. Dan's 3-year-old daughter would go on to make a full recovery from her pneumonia. And after one final round of antibiotics, this time including a dose for the cat, and one last deep clean of the house, the family's nightmare with strep throat finally went away for good. On the 30th of September 1964, a 44-year-old woman named Charlotte Lawrence stood with her husband just outside the door to her parents' apartment in a little city in southwestern Germany. Charlotte took a deep, shaky breath, the key trembling slightly in her hand. Then she unlocked the door and stepped slowly into her parents' home. Charlotte was here because of a sudden and terrible tragedy. Both of her parents had passed away just a few days ago. They had only been 70 and 76 years old, and by all accounts, they had both been in good health for their age. The story she had been told was as shocking as it was tragic. Her father had apparently suffered a massive heart attack right in their kitchen. And then, when her mother found him, the shock of it all was so great that she also had a heart attack and collapsed beside him. Charlotte's mother had managed to make a call to a doctor just before she passed, but by the time the doctor arrived, it was too late. Both of them were gone. Now, Charlotte and her husband didn't live in Germany. They had flown in that morning all the way from their home in Wisconsin. And up until this point, Charlotte had been trying to hold her emotions together, to be strong through the travel and the initial arrangements. But now, standing inside her parents' living room, surrounded by all of their familiar belongings, the pictures on the wall, the furniture they had owned for years, it was like a dam inside of her just broke. All of the grief and shock she had been holding back just poured out of her, and she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably. Her husband, not really knowing what else to do, gently guided her over to the couch. He turned on the television to a quiet program, hoping it might be a small distraction, and told her to just sit down and rest for a bit before they had to think about dinner. They actually had plans that evening. The next-door neighbor, an elderly woman named Caroline, who had been friends with her parents for years, had offered to come over and cook dinner for them. Charlotte's uncle, Dear, who lived nearby, also planned to come over after dinner to be with them. About 30 minutes later, while Charlotte was still sitting on the couch, trying to compose herself while watching TV, Caroline, the neighbor, showed up at the door. She came in with 2 big bags full of groceries and, without any fuss, went right into the kitchen and began to cook. Pretty soon, the entire apartment, which had felt so empty and sad, was filled with the smell of comfort food cooking on the stove. It made Charlotte feel, admittedly, a little bit better. Eventually, Caroline called out from the kitchen that dinner was almost ready. So Charlotte got up from the couch, went into the kitchen, and sat down at the small dining table next to her husband. After Caroline served the food, the three of them began to eat together while they waited for her Uncle Dear to arrive. Not long after, Uncle Dear did arrive. He walked up to the front door of the apartment and knocked. He waited for a full minute, but nobody came to the door. Thinking maybe they hadn't heard him, he knocked again, louder this time. But still there was no answer. This was strange. Through the door, Dear could hear the sound of the television playing in the living room, but he couldn't hear any voices, no conversation, no sound of anyone moving around inside. After a couple more minutes of waiting and knocking, he decided he would just let himself in. The door was unlocked. As Dear walked through the living room, he began calling out for Charlotte, for her husband, and for Caroline. But still, nobody called back. The apartment was eerily quiet except for the noise from the TV. An uneasy feeling started to creep over him. This was very weird. They were expecting him, so where was everybody? He walked out of the living room and headed towards the kitchen, where a light was on. And there, he saw them. Charlotte, her husband, and Caroline were all sitting at the kitchen table. But something was terribly wrong. All three of them were just sitting there, motionless. Their plates of food were half eaten in front of them. But nobody was moving. Nobody was talking. It was like they were frozen in time, all just staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. Dear, confused and concerned, walked closer. He bent down and spoke to his niece. "Charlotte? What's going on? What are you guys doing?" But when he got a good close look at Charlotte's face, and then at Caroline's face, and her husband's face, his stomach just dropped. A wave of pure horror washed over him, and he stumbled backwards away from the table. What Dear saw in that kitchen was so terrifying, so eerie, and so awful, it would actually make international news. And that apartment would forever be known by a chilling nickname, the Death House. It turned out Charlotte's parents had not died from spontaneous heart attacks on the same day. That's not what happened at all. The tragic truth was that toxic, odorless sewer gas had been leaking into the apartment through a broken pipe under the kitchen sink. That silent, invisible gas had poisoned both of Charlotte's parents, causing their hearts to stop at almost the same time. Because no one suspected poisoning, nobody thought to check for a gas leak. So, when Charlotte and her husband arrived from Wisconsin, they came to stay in her parents' apartment without any idea that the air inside was still filled with that same deadly gas. And so, as Charlotte, her husband, and their kind neighbor Caroline sat down for dinner in the kitchen, right near the source of the leak, the gas slowly poisoned them as well. When Dear finally came over, he found them all sitting around the kitchen table, frozen in their last moments, because they were already gone. Fortunately, Dear's instinct after seeing the horrific scene was to immediately get out of the apartment and go call the authorities. It was that single, quick decision that ultimately saved his life. Let me know in the comments which of these three stories disturbed you the finest. Was it the man whose skull was slowly disappearing without him even realizing it? The family that kept getting mysteriously sick because the source of the infection was sleeping in their own home? Or the apartment where people unknowingly sat down for dinner inside a room that was silently killing them? And remember, some of the most terrifying things in the world don't look dangerous at all until it's already too late. If you want another story that will stick in your head long after the video ends, there's a full playlist waiting for you right now. See ya!